Indigenous rights refer to practices, traditions, and customs that distinguish the unique culture of each First Nation and were practiced prior to European contact. These rights have been impacted by social justice, personhood, human diversity, determinants of health, and cultural safety. Our presentation will be discussing the impacts of these concepts, focusing on the topics of the 1969 White Paper, Indigenous peoples' experiences with systemic racism and impacts, and Jordan's Principle.
The 1969 White Paper, presented by Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau and Minister of Indian Affairs Jacques Reiter, proposed to eliminate Indian status, stating that this policy kept Indigenous people apart from and behind other Canadians. But it ignored more than a century of discrimination and handicaps that the state itself had imposed on Indigenous people. The approach was profoundly assimilationist and a threat to Indigenous collective rights. For example, proposed individual ownership of land would undermine the collective ownership of Indigenous groups. The social justice issue related is the equitable distribution of services that affect health, which is concerned with fair rather than equal distribution. The government of Canada is doing the talking here. The social justice issue would negatively impact health outcomes for Indigenous people as the government ignored the report of Harry B. Horton, who had been commissioned to investigate the social conditions of Indigenous people across Canada. Harry B. Horton concluded that Indigenous people were Canadians' most disadvantaged and marginalized population, attributed to years of failed government policy, particularly the residential school system and forced assimilation. These impacts include serious socio-economic barriers such as high infant mortality rates, lower life expectancy, and high incidence of disease. The determinants of health can be seen in early childhood development as a higher infant mortality rate due to malnutrition, abuse, and separation from family and culture negatively impacts development. Also, the impact of poor education access and quality are seen in the assimilatory approach to education, which provided poor quality of education and a lack of preparedness for society. Healthcare access and quality were not addressed by the White Paper to improve the lack of healthcare access and quality facing Indigenous people. The 1969 White Paper focused more on assimilation, which did not address the equitable distribution of services that impact health. Considering serious social economic barriers such as high poverty, high infant mortality, lower life expectancy, and lower levels of education compared with non-Indigenous Canadians. Relating to the concept of cultural safety, the 1969 White Paper failed to recognize and acknowledge the cultural identities of Indigenous people, did not consider their needs, and failed to meet their expectation. The White Paper was met with forceful opposition from Indigenous leaders across Canada. Some refer to it as cultural genocide. Linking this concept of cultural racism, the assimilatory approach of the government's White Paper policy conveyed that behaviors and values associated with white people or whiteness are automatically better than those associated with Indigenous groups.
I'm going to talk about Indigenous people's experience with systemic racism. This photo shows how systemic racism has affected Indigenous community. So I'll start explaining the fact sheet. The fact sheet is a second in a series focused on anti-Indigenous racism in Canada. The first fact sheet examined the concept of race and racism, exploring the various forms it takes. Racism is including systemic within the healthcare system is a significant contributor to Indigenous people. Lower health outcomes. Racial discrimination always impacts health. The direct effect of stress arising from interaction that are perceived to discriminatory. The denial of access to resources such as healthcare that fit with people's needs. The consequence of racism within healthcare is emotional and social harm to indigenous people, especially indigenous children. There is a high rate of respiratory problems and other infectious diseases among indigenous children than among non-indigenous children. Due to systemic racism, impact due to systemic racism has impacted indigenous people health. They have high rates of chronic diseases, inadequate housing, and crowded living conditions has had negative impact on indigenous people mental health. In Canada, indigenous people carry the intergenerational trauma of the residential school system, and it is married tentacles of physical and sexual abuse, such as policies were rooted in racism and colonial perspective of superiority and ownership. Today, substantial power imbalance still exists between non-indigenous healthcare providers and indigenous people, which underpins many of and unacceptable experience in the healthcare system. Yet this problem is not well understood or even perceived by many health professionals. Most do not consider the substantial historical and social drivers of illness and presentation of illness in indigenous people, indigenous patients. Systemic racism has affected indigenous people health right now. These photos show how systemic racism affected indigenous children, especially during the residential school. They still have that impact till now due to the systemic racism. Thank you.
Okay, this is Jordan's principle. I'm just going to be talking about the implementation of it, who he was, and how it came to be. So Jordan River Anderson was born on October 22, 1999. He was born with a complex genetic disorder called Carey-Feynman syndrome. He had severe developmental delay. He had a tracheotomy. He had a ventilator dependency, and he was fed through a gastrostomy tube. So he required continual around-the-clock care. When he was 2 years old, he was considered stable enough to move home to the Norway House First Nation as long as he had all of his equipment needed for survival, but this did not happen because the federal and provincial governments disputed who should cover the costs of his care. He died on February 22, 2005, at the age of 5 years old in Winnipeg, Manitoba. So this led to a federal review with the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. They concluded that the federal government had a history of discriminating against First Nations children and must place the children's best interests ahead of governmental disputes. So on December 12, 2007, the Jordan's Principle became a law. In 2016, Justin Trudeau's government appealed this decision, but it was ruled that the Canadian government must uphold and implement Jordan's Principle. So they expanded their funding for Jordan's Principle and changed their approach on this matter. So the Spirit Bear logo is used to represent First Nations children, and the teddy bear was also Jordan's favorite toy. First Nation children living on and off reserve face many obstacles within their lives. They lack access to adequate safe housing, food, quality of education, and healthcare. The cost of food within First Nations is higher than the national average. This leads to inadequate nutrition and chronic disease. Type 2 diabetes is a common disease among First Nations children. They are 4 times more likely to be hungry than a non-Indigenous child. 40% live below the poverty line, and the infant mortality rate is 3 to 7 times higher than the national average. Jordan's Principle ensures that the overall well-being of the First Nations child is being met. So 5 major areas of service include cultural and language with elder support and land-based camps, health and medical. They get their occupational, physio, speech, audiology therapies, medical equipment, transportation. Recreation is also provided in the form of equipment, registration fees, and transportation. Social supports. So supports for children in care, counseling, respite, and family treatment. They get their educational supports, in the form of cultural, emotional supports in school, one-on-one education, technology, and communication devices.
Health promotion suggestions include empowering Indigenous people in inclusive engagements to develop their health system that aligns with their vision and priorities. Another is pursuing reconciliation and healing by recognizing, anticipating, and preventing negative healthcare outcomes imposed by systemic racism that are negatively impacting Indigenous people's health. Lastly, for First Nation children experiencing social injustice, social isolation, and inadequate healthcare, Jordan's principle is designed to provide accessible programs to promote the well-being of First Nation children living on and off reserves. They provide costs for medical and health issues regarding medical equipment, occupational, physio, speech therapies, as well as audiology. Social supports and educational supports are provided as well. Strategies nurses can employ include nurses can advocate for equitable care by identifying factors that make healthcare accessible to remote communities. For example, well-equipped Indigenous birthing centers that provide care for pregnant Indigenous women within their communities. As student nurses, educating ourselves about the history of systemic racism so that we can become more knowledgeable about the impacts of colonization will empower us to raise awareness about racism in healthcare. Nurses play a big role in the implementation of Jordan's principle. They provide the assessment and help guide and direct families to the specific support needed. Nurses know the policies and advocate for children to receive the services they need. In conclusion, these three topics examine how the concepts of social justice, social determinants of health, cultural safety, and social exclusion affect Indigenous rights. The 1969 White Paper was discriminatory towards Indigenous people, negatively impacting their cultural safety, early childhood development, healthcare access and quality, and focused majorly on a racist assimilatory process that would result in cultural genocide, which will negatively impact the overall well-being and advancement of Indigenous people. The paper was later retracted. The consequences of racism within a healthcare setting are first and foremost emotional and socially harmful to Indigenous people. Racism has influenced the political, economical, and cultural circumstances of Indigenous people in Canada. Racism experienced on an individual level does harm to one person, which in turn affects one's family and friends. First Nation children face many obstacles regarding social determinants of health. Not only did they lack adequate housing, nutrition, and education, but they also required adequate healthcare services. Jordan's principle ensures that First Nation children will receive the same healthcare as other children in Canada.